Well, Muskegon is your own hometown. You know, there's just a certain unique something about a hometown that you've grown up in.
So you had to walk to work typically, and that meant you'd probably best live within a mile or so of the place you worked.
It strikes me that Muskegon had these wonderful cycles in the past where it was truly a boom city.
It was a lot of hard work, and I paid the top 25 cents an hour.
Simple, fun, you know, just being together. We didn't need drugs, we didn't need cigarettes.
There was never a job that you passed up because you just didn't want to turn down the opportunity to make a nickel.
A lot of people suffered a lot.
Western Avenue was a teeming place, particularly on a Saturday and Friday nights.
And the Accidental Sweet Shop is where us kids used to go for our Sundays and take our dates.
This has to be better than where I am now, so they came north.
And then near the courthouse, you'd go there at night, you'd see people laying around the lawn sleeping. They had no place to go.
Most of the waterfront was dominated by industry and really industry that had abandoned the waterfront.
Frankly, we'd never seen so much water in our lives as when we came to Muskegon.
And people are still, oh, this town, oh, Muskegon. I said, well, you have to come from someplace else to really appreciate what you have here.
Imagine yourself on a long, uneven avenue. You have reached a crossroads and you are making a sharp turn. At the same time you end one journey, you are moving to begin another. This was Muskegon on the threshold of the 20th century. It was a different community then. The residents of that other Muskegon had a vastly different response to their turn of the century. They didn't worry that their computers might fail or that their flying machines might fall out of the sky. And yet, in some ways, their faces are strikingly familiar. They would hardly recognize us, but we recognize them. They were our grandparents and our great-grandparents. They were our pioneers. Everywhere we went, where we worked, where we worshiped, and where we learned, we felt their touch on our lives.
My father was a drafting engineer at Morton Manufacturing. Would sit at home and draw these little drawings, and then I would go out to the plant and see these huge lathes and machinery that he had designed.
A century stands between us and that other Muskegon. That's not just a span of time packaged in a nice round number. A century is a lifetime, and then some. It's careers and milestones, it's generations of building and growth punctuated by wrecking balls and heaps of rubble. A century is marriages and tombstones, retirements and baptisms. It's war and peace and war again in an unending cycle that hammers home the fact that yes, we have been here before, and yes, we have paid a price.
Well, Muskegon is your own hometown. You know, there's just a certain unique something about a hometown that you've grown up in. And when you hear, while you're in the service, about some of your friends who have been killed in service that you played football with or went through grade school with, it gives you a very sickening feeling. I had the experience over in Iwo Jima of having Larry Omnis and Tom Irwin, both friends of mine, getting killed just ahead of me. And coming home and seeing their family and me being alive was an experience in itself. But I was able to portray to them that I know that the bodies that were shipped back, I went to graves registration personally, saw that they had their right dog tags on, because many fellas got blown up so badly that they never had their own dog tags on. And so it was a question as to whether the families would ever receive the bodies of their actual family, you know. And later on, I experienced that with my own nephew who got killed over in Vietnam on the 18th of March of 1968.
In Muskegon, it was 100 years of ups and downs, failures and triumphs. It was a litany of setbacks and persistence and determination.
It strikes me that Muskegon had had these wonderful cycles in the past where it was truly a boom city, and it enjoyed the lumbering era, as we all know, but it was also a very, very dynamic place during and following World War II. And so there was a real period in Muskegon's history where it had to struggle to find its identity again.
In Muskegon, the 20th century was born with a death, the demise of the lumber era. The lumber boom had spanned more than half a century, a period of prosperity in which dollars were manufactured from sawdust, and a small town on the Lake Michigan shore became lumber supplier for the entire country. But it couldn't last. By 1900, the forests had been exhausted, and the scores of lumber mills that had dotted the lakeshore were gone. But even if it changed the way Muskegon made a living, it never changed the fact that this was a working community.
There was never a job that you passed up because you just didn't want to turn down the opportunity to make a nickel, you know?
My first job was at Consumers Power, and then I went out to CWC, so I got involved I was secretary of the production manager, so I got in on a lot of the inner workings as well.
Most of us young kids got jobs, paper routes, lawn jobs, snow shoveling jobs, at a much earlier age than the kids do today. Well, we had to if we wanted to have any spending money, so. And that didn't hurt any of us.
Work was a part of the Muskegon character. It followed this community's residents into every aspect of their lives. How they worked was how they lived.
In that era, people didn't have adequate transportation facilities. Automobiles hadn't come in quite yet, and they really couldn't take the train. So you had to walk to work typically, and that meant you'd probably best live within a mile or so of the place you worked. So that was part of it. Of course, people would want to have a residential area near the place of employment, plus you stayed in your place of employment for a long time too, perhaps your lifetime.
A working community? Yes. But Muskegon was an enterprising community too. From the beginning, there was the driving urge to operate one's own business. In many cases, all it took was a little seed money and, of course, a vision. And from the fertile ground of inspiration and perspiration, small enterprises began sprouting across the landscape.
I was very fortunate in so far that my brother worked at Coca-Cola Bottling Company, and he was able to get me a stand on the Midway selling Coca-Cola. And we would take the cap off the Coca-Cola bottle and pour it into a cup and ask a dime for it, and the people would say, "Forget it, we're not going to pay a dime."
I went in business in 1933 with $50 that I got from my dad, and I rented space from the YMCA, and I started a food service business.
Riding the spirit of enterprise, Muskegon rode the transition from 19th century lumber queen to 20th century industry center. At the turn of the century, the Central Paper Mill came into existence, carrying the promise of 100 jobs. Continental Motors followed, moving in from Chicago to capitalize on the gasoline engine and other new technology. Brunswick Balke Collender Company chose Muskegon and added a lucrative piano case division. Then came a series of new businesses: Campbell Wyatt & Cannon Foundry, Shaw Walker, Muskegon Piston Ring, and Sealed Power.
It all started in 1911, and my grandfather at that time was employed by Continental Motors out in the machine shop as a laborer. And he and Paul Beardsley formed a partnership. And Mr. Beardsley at that time was a sales clerk, I believe, at Hardee's department store. They each put up $1,000 of their own money. It wasn't borrowed. It was their life savings. And sometime in 1911, my grandfather walked across the street with a box of piston rings and sold them to Continental Motors. And that was the beginning of the company.
With its new direction, Muskegon endured the growth pangs of the young century. It watched its young men leave for World War I, sending its fears and its prayers along with them. It survived the great influenza epidemic that followed. It outlasted the Jazz Age, it endured Prohibition, and it survived the Depression, although not without pain and shattered lives.
A lot of people suffered a lot. We didn't, thank God. It was not uncommon to have what we called tramps, now they call them homeless, come to the back door and ask for food.
During the Depression, it was very difficult to pay bills, of course. We moved into an apartment and rented our house.
But not even the Depression could cripple the community. In its very depths, the Mart Dock was dedicated as a modern port terminal on Muskegon Lake, complete with a shipping plant, a skating rink, and space for 10 vessels. Federal WPA projects added public improvements. There was even a bank opening. In 1930, the People's State Bank opened its new headquarters. But 18 months later, it closed its doors for good. It was Muskegon's only bank failure of the Depression. It was a different Muskegon in those first several decades in many ways, a more innocent Muskegon. Even when the community celebrated its 100th birthday in 1937, that innocence was on display.
I worked at the Centennial Celebration as a guard at age 15. But that was quite a celebration. They had a lot of great exhibits, many of which are still down in our Muskegon County Museum.
I can remember riding in the first car when I was about, probably 6 years old or 7. The banker got one. And then after that, the grocery store man got one. And it was a privilege to get invited to sit in one even.
I remember growing up and everyone having a victory garden. We had great fun going around and stealing everybody's tomatoes.
It was a time when you could get excited about your first automobile ride or pilfered tomatoes or the forbidden fruit of innocent contact.
Back of the theater had glass all along up above, and we would sit in the back row, and I was always afraid someone would see us holding hands. We didn't make out really held hands at that time.
But there were underlying problems that were anything but innocent. Every day, a small but growing sector of the community ran headlong into the entrenched, unwritten rules of racial segregation.
At that time, Muskegon was a very bad racial place. You couldn't go to the restaurants, you couldn't go downtown, you couldn't go bowling, none of that stuff. It was all segregated.
Here was a community struggling to cope with its growing diversity. It was a struggle that would continue to this day. That diversity exploded with the onset of the Second World War. The same community that had once strained to meet the country's lumber needs now worked round the clock to manufacture the tools of war. Factories and foundries operated 24 hours a day, and what they needed, desperately, was labor.
And all the automotive stuff was stopped, and we had to get into production of some kind of war material. Campbell, White, and Cannon were making tank treads by the thousands for the service. And so was Lakey Foundry, and so was Sealed Power. And we were all working desperately with the War Manpower Commission to man our plants. And we were sent all over the United States to recruit. In fact, some of us, as we were recruiting in the South, we were given priorities to fly. In fact, I had such a priority to fly for the War Manpower Commission that I could put Army personnel off the plane if I chose to do so, because I was assigned by the War Manpower Commission to be in a certain city at a certain time to do recruiting. And unfortunately, when I got there, those cities also were looking for manpower, so it was a difficult situation all around.
The emigration of black residents strained the community's resources, from housing to racial tolerance. It posed problems Muskegon had never had to deal with.
We had race problems that came with the influx of all the employees. Muskegon was not ready to accept them.
And it got to be a place where there's so many of them came in that it got to be a situation where there's no place for them to stay. And the times got a little kind of rough there because they came in so fast that some people just naturally didn't understand the fact that they were coming in to work, invading the territory, you might say.
But ultimately, what all this meant was a richer, more varied community experience. Each new resident brought a unique experience to Muskegon, a unique upbringing, a different family tradition, a unique approach to education.
I was a part of at the beginning, a black school. Everybody in the neighborhood walked around with a Blue Horse notebook. What a Blue Horse notebook is, on the back of the Blue Horse notebook, there were timetables from 1 to 12. Everybody had to learn your timetables. And you had a certain time that you had to learn the timetables, and you were not given, if you were going to play ball, my grandmother said, have you done your tables of sevens? If you don't know them, no, you cannot do it.
At the start of the century, one of the most distinctive features of Muskegon was a towering sand dune in Muskegon's Bluffton neighborhood. Residents called it Pigeon Hill. But in 1928, the Sand Products Corporation began a mining operation. Bit by bit, the hill disappeared until it was gone. Longtime residents remember other changes. They remember a street that ran through the very heart of town, and for them, it defined the community.
Western Avenue was a teeming place, particularly on a Saturday and Friday nights, my goodness. And I think the community really kind of made it the center of attraction. It was the place to go.
When we moved here, we moved to Webster Avenue. And at that time, the street was still cobbled, and it had maple trees that met in the middle of they were a bower almost. And we were so thrilled to be living. It was like a storybook. And I guess it was 4 or 5 years later, maybe 2 years later actually, they started taking those trees down to make Seaway Drive.
Change seemed inevitable, especially in the post-war growth period that Muskegon experienced. Just as at the beginning of the century, new industries began to appear, and again, they left their mark on the landscape. The chemical industry boomed, creating thousands of jobs and spawning an entire new support industry. But it exacted a heavy price on the soil and the water.
It's not a case of bad people who were running the chemical companies. It's the fact that the operating principles, the legislation, everybody did it differently. It was, case in point, the unlined lagoons that were the source of the groundwater contamination at this site were sanctioned by the state in the 50s. That was the state of the art. In the early days, in the mid-50s, the chemical industry, not just this isn't unique to Muskegon, but the chemical industry utilized, for the greater part, is what I call a bunker mentality. You cloistered yourself inside the bunker, you looked out through the slots, and you told your neighbors what you thought they needed to know. Well, nobody does that anymore. The chemical business is an entirely different animal. You have to earn the trust and you earn the respect of your neighbors by walking like you talk.
The century progressed and the landscape changed. It didn't happen suddenly. It was the work of decades. White flight, suburban development, new commercial trends. All of these things left their mark on the Muskegon area. They also left the African-American population concentrated in the inner cities with a growing number of boarded-up storefronts. Some of the older industries failed, symptomatic of a looming industrial decline. That decline would put people out of work by the thousands. It would have a devastating impact on the urban economy. And it would prompt a quiver of nostalgia in those who recalled Muskegon's industrial heyday.
Campbell Wine and Cannon Foundry was the largest gray iron foundry in the world. When fellows in the service would say, "Raleigh, where do you hail from?" "Muskegon, Michigan." "Where's that?" "On the beautiful shores of Lake Michigan. We're the home of the largest gray iron foundry in the world." And now there is no Campbell Wine Foundry.
The loss of old industry did more than change the landscape, it changed minds. It forced community leaders to consider new strategies. In what was once a foundry town, the tourism industry had been rekindled, and the old abandoned factories that once hummed on the shoreline were cleared for new business possibilities.
And I was amazed at the number of smaller businesses that have started up in Greater Muskegon. There are hundreds of them. And they're diversified. It's not all tool and die. It's not all heavy machining. A lot of service businesses. They seem to all be doing well.
I think that that what we've been able to enjoy is a change to a very mixed economy where there's a little bit of everything again, and that tends to serve, I think, a community well.
The lessons of the past were not lost on Muskegon. Pigeon Hill, hundreds of miles of forests. There was always that notion that the environment and its resources were inexhaustible, that they were there to be exploited. Slowly and tentatively, we have been learning a different way. And the resources that drew our attention first were Lake Michigan, Muskegon Lake, White Lake, Mona Lake, those shining blue jewels in our midst.
The county wastewater management system started up in about 1974. Frankly, many of the chemical companies were here long before that and had to depend on their own means to handle their own waste, and that was part of the problem because a lot of that ended up in the ground. The county wastewater system provided a intelligent and a successful way to treat large amounts of waste, and it has been a real boon for the county and been well managed, and we'll probably get bigger.
It was the water that attracted us in the first place and tipped us off to how special Muskegon was.
Well, Carol and I are Midwesterners, South Dakota, Oklahoma. Frankly, we'd never seen so much water in our lives as soon as we came to Muskegon. And we took to it right away.
Now, another century. Another crossroads looms ahead. It is a vastly different community from the Muskegon of 100 years ago.
Well, we seem to not need anything but each other and our simple fun, you know, just being together. We didn't need drugs, we didn't need cigarettes, we just had good times just being together.
But some things we have in common with that other Muskegon. We still travel an uneven road. We still struggle with identity and direction. We still struggle with the challenges of our own diversity. But we approach those struggles with a new, hard-earned appreciation of where we are and who we are.
I feel very comfortable. I live right in the heart of the urban community. I live on Beck Street. Wouldn't live any other place in the county. Love it.
Well, you just look out at the lake and I thought, this is it. This is the place that we want to be.
But I envision within 10 years that you won't recognize our waterfront. And it'll be the queen that it once was.
I think great things are going to happen. Of course, I've always been an optimist.
My hope is that we all come together as a people and understand black and white, there's no color barrier.
And we've obviously put good sewer systems in place, we've put good water systems in place, we've put good transportation systems in place, but we've put good cultural systems in place. If you look at the Frauenthal Theater, you look at the Elsie Walker Arena, you look at the Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp, you look at the Cherry County Playhouse, you look at the Muskegon Museum of Art and all of extensions, the improvements that we made to the Hackley and Hume home and our culture, and you combine all of those things together and then touch that to the tourism side, where we've grown the activities for people to do in this community, particularly young people. You can go to the Michigan's Adventure, you can go to the beach, you can see a historic submarine, you can use the water in the lake safely, and it's clean, we've cleaned it up, and it's the place to be. Muskegon is the place to be. It's the entertainment capital of West Michigan.
The best is yet to come, and it's already pretty good.